Hello, my dear friends, lovers of books, of stories, of words that weave themselves into the fabric of who we are. I'm so glad you're here with me again, ready to step into a film that, while it carries the sheen of a modern release, carries with it a history as old as time itself. Today we're exploring Snow White 2025. Before we begin, I'd love to ask, kindly and with all sincerity, that if you enjoy our conversations, if you find yourself taking something away from these moments of reflection, do consider liking and subscribing. It's not about numbers to me, it's about creating a space where those who crave deeper, more intellectual explorations of cinema can gather. And I should say this clearly, what follows is not a traditional review. It's not about whether a film is good or bad. This is an intellectual, theoretical, and critical analysis, crafted especially for those of you with a literature background, those who find joy in untangling themes, in peeling back layers, in letting story resonate on a symbolic level. Think of this not as critique but as conversation, a wandering, thoughtful exploration, the way one might discuss a novel long after closing its final page. What drew me into this film wasn't simply the spectacle, though spectacle it certainly has, but the way it felt like a palimpsest, a story layered upon stories, a rewriting of a tale I first encountered as a child, one that has followed me quietly into adulthood. I still remember, vividly, reading the old fairy tale in a thin, dog-eared book my grandmother kept by her bedside. The illustrations were faint, almost faded with age, but there was something haunting about the simplicity of it. The apple, the mirror, the forest, the sense of danger cloaked in beauty. Watching this new iteration, I found myself slipping back into that childlike awe, but also approaching it with the sharpened lens of someone who has studied stories, symbols, myths. It was like holding two selves at once, the wide-eyed child and the analytical adult, each whispering different truths into my ear. The film wastes no time in weaving atmosphere. From the first frame, I felt a strange blend of comfort and unease. There is something almost uncanny about seeing a story so deeply ingrained in cultural memory unfold again, but this time with new voices, new faces, new interpretations. It felt like looking at a reflection in a warped mirror, recognizable, yet shifted. And isn't that precisely what stories do when they are retold? They reflect us differently each time, showing not only the tale but also who we are in the moment of experiencing it. At its heart, the narrative unfolds in familiar beats. A young woman, striking not only in beauty but in spirit, finds herself the target of envy and cruelty. A mirror, or perhaps, more accurately, what the mirror represents, becomes the tool through which vanity festers into violence. A poisoned apple, deceptively simple, conceals a deathly trap. And somewhere in between are the woods, a space both terrifying and liberating, where exile becomes the soil of transformation. I won't spoil everything. There are surprises here, twists that reimagine the story in ways that startled me, but even in its most recognizable turns, the film leans into the tension between tradition and reinvention. What fascinated me most was the way the narrative teases its central relationships, particularly between the heroine and the woman who seeks her downfall. It's not painted in flat strokes of good and evil. Instead, it edges closer to tragedy, a story of two women bound not only by opposition but by a strange, mirror-like connection. Watching them, I was reminded of how often literature presents us with characters who are not enemies so much as reflections of one another, distorted and conflicted. It brought to mind Shakespeare's rivalries, the way Hamlet sees pieces of himself in Laertes, or how Macbeth and Banquo, though different in destiny, share a parallel path until it violently diverges. The plot, while rooted in archetypes, breathes with moments of genuine surprise. There's a chase sequence through the forest that lingers in my mind, not because of spectacle, but because of how it used the woods themselves as a character. Branches seem to close in like hands, light fractured into uneasy patterns, silence pressed down with a weight almost unbearable. I've always believed that forests in fairy tales represent more than just danger. They are thresholds, places where the familiar dissolves and one must confront the unknown within. In this film, that symbolism is brought to life in a way that felt visceral. I could almost smell the damp earth, feel the cold bite of fear in the air. And then there is the apple, oh, how the film lingers on that fruit. The camera caresses it, light glistening on its skin, red so vivid it borders on the unnatural. I couldn't help but think of how often apples appear in our cultural imagination, from Eve in the garden to the golden apple of Eris that sparked the Trojan War. An apple is never just an apple, and here, it becomes almost unbearable in its symbolism. It is temptation, danger, desire, all condensed into a single object. When the heroine reaches for it, I felt a tug in my chest, knowing what was coming, yet unable to look away. Of course, the story teases us with more than simple repetition of the familiar. Twists unfold that recast old elements in startling ways. The dwarves, for instance, are not merely quaint companions. They carry their own complexities, their own shades of light and dark. Their role in the story feels less like comic relief and more like chorus, voices that both aid and complicate the heroine's path. And there are moments, particularly near the climax, where what we expect is subverted, leaving us to question the very nature of salvation, of what it means to be awakened, to be seen, to be chosen. For me, what resonated most wasn't any single twist or spectacle, but the undercurrent of melancholy woven throughout. Fairy tales, when stripped back to their roots, are rarely cheerful. They are stories about survival, about the harshness of envy, about the cruel bargains life often demands. This film doesn't shy away from that. Even in its moments of beauty, there is a shadow, a reminder that joy is fragile, that innocence is easily poisoned. And yet, and this is why I find myself so moved, there is also resilience. The heroine's journey is not one of passive waiting but of enduring, of refusing to be erased, of finding strength in exile and betrayal. I think that's why it touched me personally. There are moments in all our lives when we feel cast out, when the world around us sharpens with cruelty, when envy or misunderstanding isolates us. Watching her wander into the woods, uncertain and alone, I was reminded of times when I too felt exiled, whether from groups, from opportunities, or even from versions of myself. And like her, I found in that exile the seeds of transformation, the ability to return stronger, more fully myself. What the film ultimately teases, and I won't give away too much, is not just a resolution, but a reframing. It asks us to look again at the familiar and see it anew. It asks us to consider who truly holds power, who truly sees clearly, and whether the mirror we all secretly consult, whether literal or metaphorical, tells us the truth, or merely what we are afraid to believe. That's the beauty of it, really. This isn't just a fairy tale retold. It's a meditation on envy, on beauty, on resilience, on the way stories shape us. Watching it, I felt as though I was in conversation not only with the film but with centuries of storytellers before it, all whispering their variations on this tale into the collective ear of humanity. And here I was, just one more listener, carrying it forward, letting it reshape itself inside me. And so, dear friends, I invite you to stay with me as we unravel more of this together, not as a checklist of plot points, but as a journey into themes, symbols, echoes of myth and memory. Because that's what makes a film like this endure, not its surface, but the way it roots itself into the soil of our imaginations, waiting, like an apple on a tree, to be noticed, to be picked, to be tasted. When the story begins, it doesn't simply announce itself with grandeur. Instead, it arrives like a whisper. The camera opens onto a kingdom draped in winter light, a world that seems caught between beauty and fragility. I remember the first time I saw that opening frame, a snowfall drifting across gray skies, the faint chime of bells echoing in the distance, and I thought to myself, this feels less like a beginning and more like the memory of one. It sets the tone for everything that follows, familiar yet unsettled, as though the world itself remembers its own story but is struggling to tell it correctly. At the center of this world is a queen. Not the stepmother we anticipate just yet, but the queen who will bring a child into the world. She is not a caricature of maternal goodness but rather a woman carved with sharpness and grace, weary from the weight of ruling, but with eyes that soften when they look upon the snow. In one of the most delicate moments, she pricks her finger while stitching against the whiteness of winter, and drops of blood fall on the fabric like stains of fate. It is from this image that she whispers her longing, A daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as dark as ebony. This moment is familiar to anyone who's read the fairy tale, but the way it unfolds here is striking in its restraint. There's no melodrama, no forced foreshadowing. Instead, it feels like a private prayer, a mother's hope cast into the silence of snow. And then, almost as quickly, that prayer is fulfilled and cruelly taken away. The queen bears her daughter, but in the aftermath, she fades, leaving behind not only a child but a kingdom starved for gentleness. I found this opening devastating, not only for the loss itself but for how quietly it settles into the story. Loss is not treated as spectacle but as inevitability. What follows introduces us to the new queen. From the very first frame she enters, you feel the shift in atmosphere. Where the first queen was tender and human, this one seems sculpted from ice and ambition. She does not stride into the castle. She consumes it as though the walls themselves bow to her presence. And here, the mirror makes its first appearance, tall, gleaming, impossibly polished, as if it reflects not only what stands before it but what lurks behind the eyes of the one who gazes in. The mirror is not presented as a mere object. It seems alive, its surface rippling faintly when spoken to, its voice neither male nor female, but something in between, smooth, detached, unnerving. When the queen asks who is the fairest, the words echo through the chamber like a spell. And though the mirror answers in her favor, the pause before it speaks is telling. It is as though the mirror knows it must lie gently before it must wound. Meanwhile, the child grows. We see her first not as a symbol, but as a girl, curious, restless, caught between innocence and the heavy expectations of her lineage. She is not shielded from the queen's coldness, though she does not yet understand it. Instead, she finds warmth in small rebellions, slipping away into the gardens, befriending servants, singing where she is not supposed to. I loved these glimpses because they ground her humanity. She is not merely the vessel of beauty that others will envy, but a person struggling to claim space in a world that wishes to define her. The tension between her and the queen builds gradually. At first, it manifests as criticism, the queen's sharp words about posture, about voice, about behavior. Yet beneath these critiques is something more dangerous, a growing recognition. Each year that passes makes the girl more radiant, and each year the queen feels her own light dimming. This is envy not as sudden eruption but as slow erosion, like a crack widening in stone. And then comes the moment that defines everything. The mirror speaks differently. The scene is staged with almost unbearable suspense. The queen stands before the glass, expecting her ritual affirmation, her comfort. But the mirror, in its measured, unblinking voice, declares that someone else now surpasses her, the young girl she has tried to keep beneath her shadow. The silence after this revelation is more chilling than any scream. You see the queen's face falter, not into rage but into something more terrifying, fear. For envy, I think, is always rooted in fear, fear of being forgotten, of being replaced, of being irrelevant. This is where the story pivots into danger. The queen's mask of civility begins to slip, and what lies beneath is ruthless calculation. She summons the huntsman, a man carved from rough loyalty, his face etched with the weariness of someone who has long been used as a tool of others' wills. She orders him to take the girl into the forest, to kill her, and to bring back proof, a token soaked in blood, a heart as evidence. I remember gripping my seat in that moment, not because I didn't know the story, but because the way it unfolded here gave it new immediacy. You could feel the weight of the order, the moral collapse it demanded. The sequence in the forest is among the most powerful in this portion of the narrative. The huntsman leads the girl deeper into the woods, his silence heavy, his movements clumsy with hesitation. She, unsuspecting at first, asks questions, marvels at the trees, tries to make sense of why she has been taken so far. The woods themselves seem alive, shadows twisting, branches clawing, air thick with damp. When the huntsman finally raises his blade, the moment stretches unbearably. Her eyes widen, not with the recognition of betrayal, but with confusion, and that confusion breaks him. He cannot kill her. Instead, he collapses into confession, urging her to flee, to run deeper into the forest where the queen's reach cannot easily follow. That choice changes everything. The girl does not die, but she is severed from the world she knew. The huntsman returns with a false heart, animal, not human, and the queen, though temporarily appeased, remains restless, as though sensing the deception. Meanwhile, the forest becomes a new stage of transformation. The girl wanders through thickets and clearings, her fear palpable, yet there is also wonder in the way the camera lingers on small details. Mushrooms glowing faintly in the underbrush, streams murmuring secrets, creatures watching from the shadows. This is not a friendly forest, but neither is it wholly hostile. It is testing her, stripping away her royal identity until she is simply a person struggling to survive. Eventually, exhaustion overcomes her, and she stumbles upon a small dwelling hidden among the trees. The cottage is almost too quaint at first glance, but inside it tells a story of absence. Chairs too many for one person, plates half-cleaned, a table cluttered with mismatched tools. She collapses there, falling into sleep as though the forest itself has finally granted her reprieve. The arrival of the house's inhabitants is staged with both humor and gravity. They are not introduced as caricatures but as distinct personalities, each carrying burdens of their own. At first, they treat her as an intruder, their suspicion sharp, their voices gruff. Yet when they see her vulnerability, when they recognize not only her beauty but her desperation, they soften. An uneasy alliance forms, rooted less in affection than in necessity. She needs shelter. They, though reluctant, need a reminder of something gentle in their harsh existence. What struck me here was how the film resisted making this moment a simple refuge. It is not a happily ever after pause but a fragile truce. The girl knows she is hunted, the men know they are taking a risk, and the shadow of the queen still looms. Yet for the first time, there is a flicker of community, of belonging, even if it is tentative. Back in the castle, the queen eventually learns the truth. The mirror, unflinching as ever, reveals that the girl still lives, that the huntsman's betrayal has spared her. The queen's fury here is volcanic, but beneath it, again, is terror. She realizes she must take matters into her own hands. And so she begins to plot, not with armies or orders, but with the intimacy of disguise, of deception. She will not simply command the girl's death, she will deliver it herself. It is in this shift, from queen to witch, from ruler to predator, that the story's stakes deepen. The girl may have found temporary safety, but the danger now comes not from hired hands but from the very heart of envy itself, clothed in cunning and malice. And though she does not yet know it, her true test has only just begun. What I find extraordinary about the way the story unfolds from here is that it refuses to grant us comfort. Even in moments of respite, there's always an undercurrent of dread, a hum in the background that whispers, "This isn't over yet." And truly it isn't. Inside the small cottage in the woods, life tries to stitch itself together into something resembling peace. The girl learns to move among her unlikely companions, not as a princess but as a guest, as a friend, even at times as family. There's something deeply moving about the way she rolls up her sleeves, helps with chores, laughs at small jokes, and listens to their troubles with the open-heartedness of someone who has been starved of real connection. These sequences are tender, but they're never allowed to become indulgent. They serve a purpose. They show us not only her resilience, but her growth. She is no longer a passive figure at the mercy of circumstance. She is beginning to shape her own place in the world. Yet the shadows grow thicker. The queen, restless and consumed by venomous envy, consults the mirror again. This time, the mirror confirms the worst. The girl's beauty has blossomed beyond even the queen's darkest fears, and her survival is a threat that gnaws at the very core of the queen's identity. That moment, when the mirror delivers its truth, is filmed with icy precision, the queen's face flickering between disbelief, rage, and, most chilling of all, resolve. And so she dons her first disguise. It's such a striking transformation. The regal, commanding figure we've seen until now is stripped away, replaced by the stooped posture and weathered face of an old peddler woman. What's uncanny is not the disguise itself but the conviction with which she inhabits it. There is a lesson here. The most dangerous deceptions are the ones we believe ourselves. When she approaches the cottage, the girl greets her with the natural kindness that has defined her character from the beginning. She does not see a threat, only an elder carrying trinkets and wares. The queen offers a gift, a bodice lace, rich in color, beautiful in design. There's a maternal echo in the way she insists on lacing it for her, tightening it around her waist. Too tight, of course. The girl gasps, collapses, her breath stolen by the cruelty hidden within the act. It's a shocking scene, not for its violence, but for its intimacy. Harm arrives not as a sword or poison, but as a gesture disguised as care. When the men return and find her motionless, the grief is palpable. They untie the lace, revive her, and she lives again. But the danger is now undeniable. She is no longer naive about the queen's intent. She knows she has been hunted, nearly lost. Yet even here, she refuses to harden completely. That's something I love about her arc. She grows wiser, yes, but she never becomes bitter. She holds on to her openness, even when it endangers her. The queen, upon learning of the failure, is enraged but undeterred. She transforms again, this time offering a comb, seemingly harmless, but laced with poison. Once more, the pattern repeats. The disguise, the gift, the false kindness masking lethal intent. Once more, the girl falters, collapses, only to be revived by those who love her enough to guard her. It's easy to ask, why doesn't she learn? Why does she keep trusting? But I think that's precisely the point. She isn't foolish, she's human. To close herself off entirely would mean losing what makes her unique, what makes her capable of inspiring loyalty and affection. Her willingness to see good even in strangers is not a weakness but a radical strength, one that, though it nearly costs her life, ultimately defines her survival.
And then comes the final act of deception, the one so deeply embedded in our cultural memory, the apple. The queen's preparation for this moment is filmed with a ritualistic gravity, as though she knows this must be her masterpiece. She mixes, stirs, chants. The apple gleams red with a seduction that borders on holy. When she appears again at the cottage, the disguise is perfected, the performance flawless. She offers the apple with casual generosity, slicing it in half, eating the harmless portion herself, leaving the cursed side for the girl. The bite is taken. The fall is immediate. This time, no loosening of laces, no removal of combs can bring her back. She lies still, not dead, but locked in a sleep that mimics it so perfectly it might as well be. The despair that fills the cottage is suffocating. The men grieve, not as protectors who have failed, but as friends who have lost someone they came to love deeply. They cannot bury her, for the thought of placing her beneath the earth is unbearable. Instead, they encase her in glass, a coffin that is both tomb and shrine, a monument to what they refuse to relinquish. Time becomes strange here. Seasons shift. Snow falls and melts, flowers bloom and wither. She remains, preserved in her beauty, untouched by decay, as though the world itself refuses to let her go. These scenes ache with melancholy. The stillness of her body contrasts with the relentless passage of time around her. And then a shift. A figure enters the story, not as a savior in gleaming armor, but as a traveler, a seeker. He stumbles upon the glass coffin, upon the grief-stricken men who guard it. He sees her, and like so many before him, is struck by her beauty. But what sets him apart is not merely admiration. There is recognition, a sense that he sees not just the surface but the life that once animated it. The moment of awakening comes almost incidentally, almost by accident. In some tellings, it is the kiss. In others, the jostling of the coffin that dislodges the cursed piece of apple. Here, it is rendered with ambiguity, as though the film refuses to reduce the miracle to a single action. What matters is that she breathes again, her chest rising, her eyes opening, her body trembling back into life. The reunion that follows is tender without being saccharine. There is joy, yes, but also shock, disbelief, and an overwhelming gratitude that borders on reverence. She is alive. She has survived. Not because she was saved, exactly, but because she endured. The final confrontation with the queen is swift, almost startling in its brevity. Word of the girl's revival reaches the castle. and the queen's fury turns to panic. She attends the wedding, disguised, of course, but her schemes unravel. Justice arrives not through vengeance, but through inevitability. Her downfall feels less like triumph and more like the collapsing of a tower that was always doomed to fall. And so the story closes with light where there had been shadow, with a sense of restoration. Yet what lingers for me is not the victory, but the cost. The girl's journey has been marked by loss, betrayal, and near death, but also by resilience, trust, and the capacity to see goodness even in a world eager to destroy it. It's easy to treat this tale as simple, predictable, even childlike. But when you sit with it, when you let the details settle in, it reveals itself as something far more complex. A meditation on envy, innocence, endurance, and the radical strength of refusing to let the world make you cruel. And that's what makes the resolution feel earned. Not because she won, but because she remained herself. What strikes me most, whenever I revisit this story, is how the characters reveal themselves not through long speeches or elaborate backstories, but through gestures, silences, and choices. They're archetypes, yes, but archetypes filled with human breath, each one echoing truths about us that we would rather not admit. Let me begin where my thoughts always linger, with the girl at the center. She begins as a figure often dismissed as naive, even passive. Her kindness is sometimes mocked in modern readings, her trust labeled as foolish. But if you look closely, really closely, her essence is not weakness at all. It is courage of an entirely different kind. She dares to remain soft in a world that has shown her sharpness, to grow up under the shadow of envy, to be threatened, exiled, and hunted, and yet to still greet strangers with open warmth. That is not naivete. That is a refusal to be remade by cruelty. It resonates with me deeply because I've known what it's like to be told that gentleness is impractical, that survival demands hardness. And yet, like her, I've seen moments when it is precisely gentleness that saves us. There is also an evolution in her that people often overlook. In the beginning, she is largely reactive, moved around like a piece on a chessboard by the desires of others. But as the story unfolds, she begins to carve her own place, especially when she embraces life in the cottage. She becomes active in building connections, in shaping community. That transformation from passive to active is subtle, but it is there, and it's what gives her final revival its power. She is not merely restored to life. She is restored to the fullness of her becoming. And then there is the queen. What a chilling portrait she paints, a woman defined not by her beauty, but by her obsession with it. On the surface, she is the villain, her cruelty straightforward, her motives transparent. But underneath, she embodies something more complicated, the terror of obsolescence, the fear of being replaced, the dread of fading into irrelevance. Her envy is not simply spite. It is rooted in the mirror's relentless reminder that her worth, in this world, is tied entirely to her appearance. I find myself both horrified by her actions and strangely sympathetic to her plight. Who among us hasn't felt the ache of comparison, the despair of never being enough? Of course, most of us do not attempt murder to silence that ache, but the raw emotion is recognizable. Her disguises reveal as much about her as her outbursts. Each transformation into a peddler, an old woman, a stranger, it's not just a tactic, it's a confession. She cannot achieve her goals as herself. She must fracture, split, fragment into masks, as though she no longer believes in her own face. The tragedy of the queen is that she is so desperate to destroy another that she destroys
herself first. I see in her not just villainy, but the warning of what happens when envy becomes the only mirror we ever look into. The men in the cottage are often treated as comic relief, their quirks exaggerated, their presence reduced to numbers. But what I notice most about them is how they represent the spectrum of human responses to vulnerability. Each one reacts differently to her arrival. Some are suspicious, reluctant to trust this outsider. Others are protective almost immediately. But together, they form a collective lesson. The power of community is not in uniformity, but in the way differences can unite around shared care. Their love for her is not romantic, not even particularly sentimental. It is grounded in daily life, in working together, in watching over her. There's something quietly radical about that her survival depends not on a single hero, but on a group willing to share their space, their food, their lives. And speaking of heroes, let us not ignore the figure who arrives at the end, the one who breathes life back into her story. He is a strange character, precisely because he enters so late, almost an afterthought. In many tellings, he is flat, defined by his admiration of her beauty and little else. Yet, if we consider him critically, there is something symbolic about his timing. He does not fight battles for her. He does not slay dragons or confront villains. Instead, he encounters her in death, or what appears to be death, and recognizes her worth. His role is not to rescue her from external danger, but to affirm that her life is still hers, still valuable. To me, he represents the world finally catching up to what she has always been. But perhaps the most haunting character is the mirror. It speaks little, only when asked, and yet its words drive the entire narrative. It is not alive, not human, but it embodies the role of truth-teller, or at least, the role of one who defines truth. And this is where it becomes complex. The mirror does not lie, but it also does not comfort. Its truth is blunt, merciless, a weapon in the wrong hands. It makes me wonder, what if truth, delivered without compassion, is as dangerous as any lie? The Queen clings to the mirror's words as though they are law, but in reality, they are only reflections of a shallow measure of worth. In that sense, the mirror becomes a character we might recognize in our own lives, the voice of comparison, the unyielding standard, the inner critic that insists we will never measure up. Even the apple deserves to be considered as more than a prop. It is temptation made visible, the ordinary object transformed into the extraordinary symbol. The apple is the Queen's final disguise, her masterpiece of deceit, beauty on the outside, death on the inside. But it also reflects the girl's essence, because she accepts it not out of greed but out of trust. She eats not to gain power or knowledge, but because she believes in the kindness of a stranger. And that is what makes it tragic. The apple is not just poison, it is betrayal crystallized into fruit. When I think about all these figures together, what emerges is not a tale of good versus evil in the simplistic sense, but a meditation on the ways people respond to the inevitability of change. The girl embraces it. She grows, adapts, survives. The Queen resists it. She fights, disguises, destroys. The men learn to accommodate it, opening their home and hearts to someone who alters their lives. The prince accepts it, stepping into a story already in motion, allowing himself to be changed by what he finds. And the mirror reflects it, coldly, relentlessly, without care for the damage it causes. It makes me think of how stories endure not because they are fantastical, but because they are true in ways that feel uncomfortably close. Haven't we all been the girl, holding on to kindness when the world tried to harden us? Haven't we all been the Queen, gazing into our own mirrors, tormented by comparison? Haven't we all relied on the unexpected shelter of others, or been jolted awake by recognition when we thought all was lost? And in this way, the characters are not distant figures in a fairy tale. They are us. They are the parts of us we hide, the parts of us we celebrate, the parts of us we fear. That's what makes the story so enduring, not that it is about royalty and magic, but that it is about the daily battle of choosing who we will be when envy whispers, when cruelty tempts, when trust feels dangerous. The girl, the Queen, the companions, the mirror, even the apple, each one is a reflection, a fragment of the human soul. And when the credits roll, when the story closes, what lingers is not their distance from us, but their proximity. They are not figures of legend. They are us, laid bare, dressed in fable so that we might dare to look at them. What has always amazed me about stories like this is how much mystery surrounds not just what unfolds on the screen, but what lingers behind it. When we sit in the darkened theater, eyes fixed on the glowing images, it feels so seamless, every frame polished, every sound deliberate, every movement intentional. And yet, what we see is only the surface. Beneath that shimmering illusion lies a chaos of accidents, near disasters, inspired improvisations, and quiet miracles that no audience would ever suspect. To me, these behind-the-scenes secrets often feel stranger and more haunting than the fairy tale itself. They're the secret pulse of the movie, the heartbeat hidden just beneath its skin. I remember the first time I started digging into these oddities. It was like discovering that the walls of a familiar house had hidden rooms, doors I'd never opened. Suddenly, I was seeing everything differently. A single scene I once thought of as light and magical was revealed to be the product of dozens of small struggles. An actor who fainted under the heavy costume, a camera jammed at the worst possible moment, a line rewritten in panic seconds before the shot. And what struck me most was how these accidents often made the film better. Perfection wasn't planned. It was stumbled into. Take, for instance, the strange choice of the forest sequence, that hallucinatory, shadow-soaked passage where the girl flees into the woods, and the trees seem alive, clawing, whispering, trapping her. It has always been a disturbing moment, especially for younger viewers. But what most people don't know is that the uncanny effect wasn't entirely intentional. The original design had been gentler, softer, more dreamlike than nightmarish. But a freak accident on set changed everything. A lighting rig failed, plunging half the set into darkness. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the artificial trees, and the camera, rolling almost by mistake, captured something eerie and uncanny. Instead of reshooting, the director leaned into it, realizing that the unplanned terror gave the sequence a raw power no careful design could match. So that sense of unease we all feel when watching her stumble through the forest isn't just crafted, it's born of a technical failure that transformed into art. Another oddity lies in the apple, that perfect, glossy red fruit, which has become as iconic as any glass slipper or magic lamp. During production, the team experimented with over 100 different props, none of which seemed right. Real apples looked dull under the studio lights. Wax replicas melted. Painted would appear too stiff. Then, one of the prop makers, frustrated beyond belief, borrowed a technique from pastry chefs, glazing an actual apple in layers of edible shellac mixed with food dye. The result was so unnervingly flawless that it seemed unreal, a fruit too perfect to exist in nature. The cast reportedly avoided eating apples on set afterward because the sight of that uncanny prop made them uneasy. It's strange to think that something so simple, a piece of fruit, required more innovation and obsession than some entire costumes. But that's the thing about film, the smallest detail can carry the weight of the entire story. And oh, the costumes. I think of them almost like characters in themselves. What I find fascinating is how much discomfort lurked beneath their beauty. The Queen's elaborate gowns, heavy with embroidery and velvet, were so weighty that the actress often needed help simply walking to her mark. There's a story of her collapsing in exhaustion after a long day of shooting, whispering to the director with dry humor, "This dress is the real villain." Meanwhile, the girl's dress, seemingly light and airy on screen, was in fact layered with hidden structure to hold its shape. The irony is delicious. The one who appears to float suffered from wires and stiff corseting, while the one who commands the screen in power was dragging around a costume so heavy it felt like a burden. The animals, too, carry their own strange tales. Some scenes employed trained animals, others relied on puppetry or early visual effects. But the oddest moment came when a live bird, meant to alight gently on the actress's hand, instead flew directly into a lighting fixture, causing chaos on set. Miraculously, the actress kept her composure, improvising by simply extending her arm and smiling, as though waiting patiently. The handlers rushed to calm the bird, but in that moment the director saw something magical, her calmness amid chaos. That shot never made it into the final cut, but the energy of it shaped the rest of the sequence. Sometimes, it's not what is captured, but what is lost, that leaves a strange fingerprint on the art. Even the mirror has its secrets. The prop was not simply reflective glass, but a carefully constructed combination of polished metal and hidden projection. To create the illusion of a voice emerging from it, technicians had to whisper lines through a hidden tube, their voices warped by echo chambers. On certain days, the setup malfunctioned, and the actress playing the Queen had to deliver her lines into silence, pretending to react to a voice that wasn't there. Some said it added an edge to her performance, a sense of paranoia, of listening to something that might not exist. To me, that feels uncanny, almost metaphysical, the Queen talking to an empty mirror, hearing voices only she believes in. Was it art? Was it accident? Or was it something stranger? One of the strangest production stories concerns the cottage. You'd think the set would be cozy, comforting, a refuge from the darkness of the forest. But behind the camera, it was anything but. The ceilings were so low that the crew had to crawl or crouch to move around. Lighting equipment barely fit. Camera operators bumped their heads constantly. And because of the cramped design, the air grew stiflingly hot under the studio lamps. It's said that the laughter you hear in some of the lighter scenes was not entirely acting. It was the delirium of cast and crew trapped in what felt like a suffocating dollhouse. I find it ironic that the cottage, which represents safety and community in the story, was a kind of claustrophobic nightmare for those who built it. There's also something strange about how the final moments were filmed, the moment of revival. It looks serene, effortless, almost otherworldly. But in reality, it took weeks of failed attempts. The prop coffin was so reflective that every camera showed up in the glass, ruining the shot. They tried angling, they tried smoke to dull the surface, they even considered changing the coffin altogether. Finally, one of the junior crew members suggested layering the glass with an invisible film designed for storefront displays. That small, almost desperate idea saved the entire sequence. It's odd to think that the climax of the entire film, the moment audiences remember most, hung on an overlooked piece of retail technology. And then there are the myths that spread around the set, whispered like ghost stories. Some crew members swore the mirror was cursed. Others claimed the apple, left overnight, never rotted, no matter how many weeks passed. Superstitions grew, not because anyone truly believed them, but because the story itself seemed to invite the uncanny. When you spend months surrounded by tales of poisoned fruit, enchanted objects, and voices from mirrors, it begins to seep into you. I can almost imagine them, late at night, lingering on set after everyone else had gone home, looking uneasily at a prop that seemed to stare back. Even the editing carried its share of oddities. One reel was mysteriously misplaced, found weeks later in a completely different studio. No one ever figured out how it ended up there. And when the editor spliced it back into sequence, he noticed something uncanny. The footage seemed sharper, brighter, almost more vivid than the rest. Some dismissed it as a chemical fluke in the film stock. Others, in hushed tones, wondered if the story itself had marked it. I don't believe in curses, but I do believe that stories sometimes carry energy, and maybe, just maybe, that reel bore a fragment of it. But perhaps my favorite strange fact is not eerie at all. It's quietly human. On the very last day of filming, the crew, exhausted and emotional, gathered together in the cottage set. They cooked a meal on the tiny stove, an actual meal, not a prop. They sat in the cramped little chairs, bumping elbows, laughing, eating together like the characters themselves. For a few hours, the boundary between story and reality dissolved. They weren't cast and crew anymore. They were a little family, sharing food in a house that would soon be dismantled, existing only on screen. To me, that is the strangest fact of all, that in the midst of illusions and artifice, something real emerged, fleeting but true. And that, perhaps, is what makes these behind-the-scenes tales so endlessly fascinating. They remind us that movies are not perfect machines but messy, unpredictable, almost living things. They are shaped by accidents, by human error, by strange coincidences that cannot be planned. The strangeness is not a flaw. It is the soul. When we learn these stories, we watch the film differently. We no longer see it as a polished object handed down to us, but as a tapestry woven of chance and chaos, of human struggle and human joy. In the end, these facts, the cursed mirrors, the collapsing costumes, the uncanny apples, the laughter in the suffocating cottage, feel almost like a second story hidden beneath the first. The story of humans wrestling with magic, not just on screen, but in reality. And isn't that, in a way, the truest fairy tale of all? What has always struck me when reflecting on this story is how the major events don't just serve as plot points. They feel like emotional thresholds, the kind of symbolic doors you step through and never quite return from the same person. Watching them unfold, I found myself less concerned with the mechanics of what happens and more drawn to the lingering resonance of what it means. Every turn in the story felt layered. A narrative beat, yes, but also a moral parable, a psychological portrait, and in some ways, a mirror for our own anxieties and longings. That's what makes the film so much more than entertainment. It's an experience that stays in your bones. Take the beginning, for example, where innocence is so fragile it seems to tremble like a candle flame in a draft. The early world is painted in tones of safety, warmth, and almost too perfect simplicity. But this perfection is not accidental. It's constructed deliberately, almost like a stage set, to make us feel how precarious it is. When the first cracks appear, when jealousy rears its head in the form of whispered malice, it feels devastating not because we didn't expect conflict but because we already sense how fragile the harmony was. From a critical perspective, that opening segment sets up the dualities the film never stops exploring. Innocence against corruption, nature against artifice, trust against betrayal. Without this soft beginning, the darkness to come wouldn't cut as deeply. The arrival of the mirror changes everything. Critics have long debated whether the mirror is merely a plot device or a full character in its own right. What fascinates me is how its presence shifts the Queen's arc from human insecurity into something mythic, archetypal. It's not just that she fears losing her beauty, it's that the mirror externalizes the voice of self-doubt, the insidious whisper of inadequacy that lurks in all of us. Watching her lean closer, waiting for its verdict, I felt a chill not because of her cruelty but because I recognized the act itself. Who among us hasn't leaned too close to our own reflection? Not in glass, perhaps, but in the imagined judgments of others. This event, the conversation with the mirror, is both intimate and terrifying. It is the moment the story shifts from personal rivalry into cosmic struggle, because once you externalize doubt, it begins to rule you. Then comes the order, the act of sending another human into the woods to do the unthinkable. What makes this event so unsettling is not its brutality but its coldness. The Queen does not strike with her own hand. She delegates. And that, from a critical perspective, is the true horror. Evil here is not passion but bureaucracy. Violence becomes an errand, cruelty a task performed at a distance. When the reluctant servant hesitates, clutching the blade but trembling, the scene crystallizes the theme of moral choice. In that moment, he is every human caught between obedience and conscience. Critics sometimes focus on the girl's innocence as the moral center of the story, but I've always believed the servant holds the film's quietest, most human moment of truth. He chooses mercy, and that small rebellion ripples outward, saving not only her life but perhaps his own soul. The sequence in the forest remains one of the most haunting passages in cinema, and I've often thought of it as the film's true descent. Watching her stumble, clutching at branches that seemed to claw at her, I felt something almost primal stirring. Critics often describe it as a surreal dreamscape, but for me, it reads more like a cinematic panic attack, rendered in foliage and shadow. Every tree looms as a threat, every root conspires to trip her. Yet the deeper resonance lies not in fear alone but in transformation. She enters the forest as a girl fleeing death and emerges as someone tempered, scarred, and reshaped by trial. It's no accident that forests in folklore are always liminal spaces. They are the crucibles of identity, the places where innocence is burned away so that something stronger can be born. This scene does not just terrify, it baptizes her in fear, so that the rest of the journey becomes possible. When she discovers the cottage, the tone shifts dramatically, and I've always found that shift fascinating. Critics sometimes dismiss this segment as comic relief, but I think that misses the deeper function. The cottage represents the first true test of community. Unlike the isolated palace or the hostile forest, here she encounters a space already occupied, shaped by lives foreign to her own. Her decision to clean, to nurture, to make herself useful, on the surface, it looks like old-fashioned domesticity. But looked at critically, it becomes a symbolic negotiation. How do we earn belonging in a world not made for us? She carves a place for herself not by conquest but by care. It's a subtle reversal of power. Rather than taking through force, she gives, and in giving, she is welcomed. That, to me, is not comedy but quiet revolution. And yet, harmony never lasts in this tale. The Queen's return, armed with trickery, shifts the narrative into its darkest tones. The first attempt, with the laces, is a masterstroke of subtle horror. Here, the attack is not through poison or weaponry but through fashion itself, the manipulation of beauty into a form of suffocation. Critics sometimes overlook how subversive this is. The very garments designed to enhance femininity become instruments of death. It's a searing commentary on the ways society often strangles women with its own ideals of beauty. And the fact that it takes the intervention of her companions to save her underscores the theme of interdependence. Alone, she cannot resist these insidious traps. But in community, there is rescue. The second attempt, with the comb, intensifies the pattern. This time, it is not external adornment but personal grooming turned against her. A comb, the symbol of self-care, of order, of control over one's appearance, becomes the agent of collapse. Watching her slump, life drained, I felt a chill deeper than any jump scare could provide. Because here, the villain weaponizes not just objects but rituals of everyday life. That's what makes the event so resonant. It suggests that danger doesn't always arrive as a dragon or a sword. Sometimes, it hides in the familiar, in the daily habits we trust. And then, of course, comes the apple, the moment that critics, audiences, and casual viewers alike remember above all else. The apple is not just a poisoned fruit. It is temptation distilled, an object glowing with all the allure of desire. What fascinates me is how the scene lingers, how it seduces us as much as it seduces her. We know what will happen, we almost want to cry out in warning, and yet a part of us thrills at the inevitability. This duality, dread and desire intertwined, is the essence of tragedy. The bite itself feels less like a plot twist and more like a ritual act, the consummation of everything the story has been building toward. In that single moment, innocence dies, beauty falters, and the weight of mortality descends.
Critically, the apple is also a mirror to the earlier moment with the servant. There, she was spared by mercy. Here, she falls by deception. Both acts reveal the fragility of life, how it hangs not on grand battles, but on tiny decisions. One man's compassion, one woman's misplaced trust. It is these contrasts that elevate the story beyond fairy tale simplicity into something enduring, something that speaks to the precariousness of being human. The reaction of the companions to her collapse is another crucial event. Their grief is raw, unpolished, almost uncomfortable to watch. And yet, it grounds the narrative in a way spectacle never could. Critics often point out that this is where the film risks descending into melodrama, but I disagree. To me, the grief is not exaggerated but necessary. Without it, the later resurrection would feel hollow. The sight of them gathered around her, devastated, transforms the story from individual tragedy into communal mourning. This event reminds us that death, or even the appearance of it, is never private. It reverberates outward, shaping everyone it touches. And then, of course, comes the final miracle. Her revival is perhaps the most debated moment of the entire film. Is it an act of fate, of destiny, of true love? Critics have argued endlessly, some deriding it as cliché, others defending it as archetype. For me, its power lies not in logic, but in feeling. It resonates because it affirms what we most want to believe, that death is not the end, that despair is not final, that love, however we define it, carries a force stronger than poison. The revival is not simply narrative convenience. It is thematic necessity. Without it, the story would collapse into nihilism. With it, the cycle completes. Innocence lost, trial endured, death embraced, and life restored. And then, in the aftermath, comes the reckoning, the Queen's downfall. The manner of her punishment, so vivid and cruel, has always sparked controversy. Some see it as too harsh, others as poetic justice. Personally, I see it as symbolic closure. She who worshipped beauty is destroyed by ugliness. She who thrived on control is undone by humiliation. The event is grotesque, yes, but it completes the moral logic of the tale. In a world shaped by archetypes, there can be no gentle fade-out for the embodiment of envy. Her end, as brutal as it is, cements the story as one of cosmic justice rather than human mercy. What fascinates me most is how these events, from the trembling beginnings to the harsh conclusion, continue to resonate long after the credits roll. Critics may argue over their execution, but audiences feel their weight instinctively. That's why the story endures. It is not simply about a girl, a queen, and a poison apple. It is about the way innocence confronts envy, the way community redeems loneliness, the way love, however mysterious, restores what death tries to steal. Each event is a parable, each twist a mirror reflecting something back at us. And when I think about the reception, both critical and popular, I find it unsurprising that opinions diverge. Some call it too dark, others too sentimental, still others too moralistic. But perhaps that's the secret. The events invite us to argue because they refuse to settle into one easy interpretation. They provoke, unsettle, and stir. And isn't that the mark of true art? That a poisoned apple, a dark forest, a shattered mirror can spark debates as fierce as any political discourse? That a simple fairy tale can hold, within its events, a mirror to our deepest fears and desires? For me, that's the resonance that lingers. Not the perfection of its craft, not the polish of its design, but the strange weight of its events. Each one like a stone dropped into the pond of my memory, sending ripples outward long after the story is done. And maybe that's why I keep returning again and again to these moments. Because in them, I see not just a story, but a reflection of myself, of all of us, stumbling through forests of our own, biting into apples we should resist, and still, somehow, finding resurrection in the most unexpected places. What always fascinates me about films like this is how seamless they appear on the screen, as though every detail, from the flicker of candlelight to the glint of a tear, simply appeared effortlessly, waiting to be captured. But the truth is never that simple. What we see in the theater is only the final layer of a tapestry woven with sleepless nights, strange accidents, whispered jokes on set, and more than a few strokes of sheer luck. For this film, that tapestry is especially rich, and every thread tells a story. When I first began learning about how it was made, I expected the usual accounts of green screens, costume fittings, and camera rigs. And yes, those were there. But what struck me most was how personal the process felt to those involved. Each member of the crew, from the director down to the assistant tasked with keeping continuity notes, seemed to carry a sense of reverence, as if they weren't just making a movie, but contributing to a living myth. That attitude shaped every choice, from the sweeping cinematography to the tiniest sound effect. Take the forest, for instance. You'd assume it was mostly CGI, given its surreal, otherworldly quality. But surprisingly, much of it was shot in real, painstakingly selected locations. The production team spent months scouring woodlands across Europe, finally settling on a mix of ancient forests in Germany and a few carefully planted sets built in soundstages back in London. The real forests offered something no computer could replicate: the unevenness of nature, the way sunlight filtered unpredictably through leaves, the crunch of damp earth underfoot. Yet they also brought headaches, unpredictable weather, invasive insects, and even a particularly stubborn owl that insisted on roosting directly above the main set. One crew member joked that the owl should have gotten its own screen credit, given how many takes were ruined by its screeches. And then there was the cottage. You'd think such a structure would be designed digitally, especially since it needed to look like something out of a dream. But the production designer insisted it be built full scale. For weeks, carpenters and set decorators labored, crafting tiny wooden chairs, unevenly carved tables, and hand-painted crockery. The inside was deliberately cramped, so much so that the actors playing the companions could barely move without bumping elbows. The funny part is that claustrophobia ended up helping their performances. Being forced into each other's space created a natural, bumbling intimacy, which translated beautifully on screen. More than one actor admitted that after filming in that cottage, they developed an almost brotherly bond simply because they'd been literally rubbing shoulders for hours on end. But what really captivated me were the unplanned moments that slipped into the film almost by accident. There's one story about a scene where the young heroine collapses onto the wooden floor in despair. The script had her sob quietly, but on one take, she fell harder than expected, accidentally knocking over a small stool. Instead of breaking character, she clutched at it, as if
trying to hold on to something solid in her grief. The director loved the rawness of it so much that the stumble was kept in the final cut. To most viewers, it probably looks like a perfectly choreographed gesture. In reality, it was clumsy, painful, and completely real. That's the magic of production. The accidents sometimes shine brightest. Sound design brought its own share of surprises. The forest's ominous atmosphere, with branches groaning and whispers riding on the wind, wasn't made by trees at all. Instead, the sound team spent hours recording old wooden doors creaking in a warehouse, then layering those groans with slowed-down audio of whispers recorded in a church. The combination gave an eerie resonance, half natural, half supernatural. And those bird calls you hear in the background? Many weren't birds at all but human voices pitched and distorted until they sounded otherworldly. I remember laughing when I learned that one particularly chilling screech actually came from a crew member imitating his cat in frustration. Imagine that, one man's pet-inspired joke becoming part of a cinematic nightmare. Costuming was another realm where art and accident collided. The Queen's gowns, heavy with embroidery and metallic accents, weighed close to 40 pounds each. The actress confessed that walking in them felt like dragging chains. On one occasion, the train of her gown got caught on a nail in the set floor, ripping an entire seam. Instead of panicking, she turned it into part of her performance, spinning dramatically as though the gown were a beast she needed to tame. The crew repaired it overnight, but the director kept the footage, saying it revealed something raw about her character, the sense of fighting against her own beauty. One of my favorite anecdotes involves the poisoned apple. Dozens of versions were created by the props department. Some real, some wax, some hollow with hidden tubes for smoke effects. The problem was they all looked too perfect. The director wanted it to seem irresistibly delicious but also slightly uncanny. After weeks of trial, a crew member suggested something absurd. Why not spray the apple with honey and dust it with edible glitter under the lights? Against all odds, it worked. The apple gleamed with a tempting sheen that looked both mouth-watering and strangely unnatural. The funny twist? During one take, the actress actually bit into the honeyed version by mistake and nearly gagged at how cloyingly sweet it was. Everyone burst into laughter, the tension broken, and she gamely asked for another take, this time with the hollow prop. Not all the behind-the-scenes stories were lighthearted, though. Filming the collapse scene, where the heroine succumbs to the apple's poison, took its toll emotionally. Lying still for hours, surrounded by silent, grieving castmates, created a heaviness on set. Crew members admitted they sometimes stepped outside just to shake it off. The actress herself later said that those scenes were some of the hardest of her career, not because of the physical stillness but because of the weight of embodying such profound loss. And yet, it's precisely that weight that gives the scene its power. The film asks her, and by extension, us, to confront mortality, and in doing so, it demands sincerity even in make-believe. The ending had its own quirks. The climactic resurrection scene was filmed multiple times with subtle variations. In one version, the moment of awakening was accompanied by a swell of orchestral music. In another, silence reigned, broken only by the sound of breath returning. The debate raged for weeks. Should it be grand or intimate? Ultimately, they chose intimacy, and I think it was the right call. That decision was shaped not by storyboards but by the instinct of the editor, who reportedly wept every time she played back the quieter cut. That's the kind of detail critics rarely mention, but it shows how emotional responses guide technical decisions. Sometimes, the most intellectual choice is also the most human one. There were logistical challenges too, of course. Horses refused to cooperate during key scenes, leading to hours of delays. Rainstorms destroyed carefully constructed sets. One time, a fog machine malfunctioned and filled the studio with such thick smoke that fire alarms went off, forcing an evacuation. Far from derailing the production, though, these mishaps became part of its lore. Crew members joked that the film was cursed by jealous spirits, much like its own storyline. And yet, they pushed through, driven by the sense that they were making something timeless. What lingers most for me, though, is how much joy and play existed alongside the struggle. Between takes, cast members often sang together, turning the gloomy forest into an impromptu concert hall. The dwarfs actors, in particular, became infamous pranksters, hiding props or sneaking snacks into their tiny pockets, only to pull them out mid-scene. Their laughter was contagious, and many crew members later said those moments of levity kept them sane through grueling hours. One cameraman confessed that the best part of his job was trying not to shake the camera while laughing at their antics. And here's a little-known fact. The final scene of Celebration, with everyone gathered in joy, was filmed not at the end of production but right in the middle. The schedule demanded it, but it had an unintended effect. For the cast, it became a preview of closure, a reminder of where their characters would end up even as they returned to darker scenes afterward. Several actors later said it helped them carry hope through the heavier filming days. Knowing that joy awaited, even fictionally, made the journey bearable. When I think about all these production insights, what strikes me is how much of the film's magic lies not in perfect planning but in imperfection. The accidents, the laughter, the frustrations, they shaped the story just as much as scripts and storyboards did. The film we see is a polished jewel, but hidden inside it are the fingerprints of everyone who touched it. Every screeching owl, every glitter-dusted apple, every ripped seam is part of its soul. And somehow, knowing those stories makes me love it even more. Because isn't that what cinema is at its heart? A gathering of flawed, determined humans trying to conjure something greater than themselves. A process filled with sweat and tears, yes, but also with honey-slicked apples and owl calls that become immortalized forever. The production of this film wasn't just about cameras and costumes. It was about the delicate, unpredictable alchemy of people coming together, stumbling, laughing, persevering, and, against all odds, creating a world that now lives inside ours. What always astonishes me about films of this kind is the way they transport us, not with spells or potions, but with something subtler, the careful construction of place. Before a single word is spoken, before a single note of music swells, the setting already speaks to us. Tells us what kind of world we're stepping into, what shadows we should fear, what beauty we should trust, and what secrets might be hiding just beyond the treeline. Watching this film, I found myself immersed not just in its story but in the feeling of its spaces, as though the forest, the castle, and the tiny cottage weren't backdrops at all, but characters with their own moods, tempers, and fates. The forest, for instance, is more than trees. It is mystery itself, a realm of shifting shapes and whispered fears. In some moments, the cinematography captures it as a cathedral of green, sunlight filtering through ancient branches in shafts that resemble divine light. In others, that same forest twists, the camera tilting upward to distort the trunks, shadows pooling until it feels suffocating. I remember holding my breath in those moments, not because I didn't know what would happen, but because the setting itself seemed alive, conspiratorial, almost eager to swallow the characters whole. What fascinated me most was how the filmmakers played with contrasts within that single space. A bird fluttering across the frame might momentarily turn menace into wonder, reminding us that even in the darkest corners, beauty insists on being seen. The camera lingers on small details, moss clinging to bark, the delicate shiver of leaves stirred by unseen winds, as though reminding us that this is not a fairy tale backdrop but a real, breathing ecosystem. And that attention to detail carries emotional weight. When the heroine first flees into this wilderness, her terror is palpable not just because of her fear but because the forest itself seems to respond, closing in on her, overwhelming her. Later, when she finds solace within its glades, the same space feels protective, almost maternal. What changed? Not the forest, but her relationship to it, and by extension ours. Then there is the castle looming in contrast. Cold stone, high walls, and endless shadows. Where the forest breathes with organic unpredictability, the castle suffocates with rigid control. Its geometry is sharp, unyielding. Every hall feels designed to dwarf those who walk it. The cinematography exaggerates this, often framing the queen at the top of staircases or beneath vaulted arches, so that she seems inseparable from the architecture itself. Watching her move through those corridors, I often thought of her as another tower or gargoyle, another extension of stone and malice. The castle, in this sense, is not her home but her body, her kingdom manifest in walls that keep out both warmth and mercy. I loved the way the lighting worked within those walls. Firelight flickers across cold stone, never soft enough to make the space feel warm. Mirrors reflect not clarity but distortion, fragments of faces that seem slightly off, slightly wrong. The cinematographer used these reflections masterfully, often showing the queen's face multiplied, fractured, as though even she could not contain her own image. And in those choices, we glimpse something profound. The castle doesn't just house evil, it amplifies it. It becomes a shrine to vanity, a fortress of isolation. Every shadow, every echo, contributes to its suffocating spell. But perhaps my favorite setting, and the one that always tugs most fiercely at my heart, is the cottage. Small, crooked, tucked away like a secret, it feels almost laughably insignificant compared to the grandeur of the castle or the immensity of the forest. And yet, this is the heart of the story. Here, domesticity and intimacy hold sway. The cinematography shifts in tone the moment we enter. Instead of sweeping crane shots or oppressive wide angles, we get close-ups, handheld movements, frames filled with clutter and warmth. You can see the texture of wood, the smudges on mugs, the faint smoke curling from a crooked chimney. It's messy, lived-in, imperfect, and all the more human because of it. What struck me most, though, was how the lighting changed within that space. Sunlight streaming through small, uneven windows feels soft, almost golden. Shadows are gentler, less threatening. The camera often lingers longer here, as though reluctant to leave. And emotionally, so are we. After the vastness of the forest and the coldness of the castle, the cottage feels like a heartbeat, a reminder of why the struggle matters. It's not just about defeating evil, it's about protecting the fragile beauty of shared meals, laughter, and friendship. That shift in setting is a shift in soul. Beyond these primary spaces, the film also offers fleeting but unforgettable glimpses of liminal worlds, the meadow where sunlight seems almost too bright, the river whose surface reflects more than it reveals, the market town bustling with ordinary life that feels alien in a story filled with magic and menace. Each of these moments serves as a palate cleanser, a reminder that the world is larger than the central conflict. They also ground the story. Without them, everything might feel too distant, too mythical. With them, we are reminded that this fairy tale world has texture, scale, and variety, that wonder and danger exist side by side. Cinematography is the thread that binds all these settings together, shaping not only how we see them but how we feel them. Wide shots of the forest emphasize isolation, making the heroine seem small against towering trees. Low angles in the castle exaggerate its power, turning doorways into mouths that threaten to swallow her. Gentle, steady pans in the cottage suggest comfort, even laziness, as though time itself slows down within those walls. These aren't just technical tricks, they're emotional cues, guiding our breath, our pulse, our trust. Color, too, plays its part. The forest shifts from emerald greens to near-black shadows, depending on the scene's emotional tenor. The castle is dominated by grays and silvers, occasionally punctured by blood red, always a reminder of violence lurking beneath the surface. The cottage bursts with warm earth tones, browns, yellows, muted oranges. Watching, you can almost feel the temperature shift between these spaces. Cold in the castle, temperate in the forest, warm in the cottage. It's not just storytelling, it's sensory storytelling, drawing us deeper into the film's emotional climate. And then there are the smaller cinematic elements that almost slip by unnoticed, but once seen, cannot be forgotten. The way the camera sometimes tilts ever so slightly during moments of unease, creating a subconscious sense of imbalance. The way shadows are allowed to creep longer than natural, hinting at a world where darkness stretches farther than it should. The way close-ups linger on hands, trembling, clutching, releasing, reminding us that power, love, and despair all manifest in the simplest gestures. What makes this particularly powerful, I think, is how consistent yet unpredictable it feels. Every shot seems intentional, yet never mechanical. The world breathes and the camera breathes with it. That breathing is what makes the setting feel alive. I still remember one particular sequence where the heroine runs through the forest at dusk. The camera doesn't just follow her, it races alongside her, weaving between trees, blurring edges, letting shafts of light strobe her figure. You don't simply watch her run. You feel the disorientation, the desperation, the ache in your own lungs. That's what the best use of setting and cinematography can do: collapse the distance between screen and soul. And what about the use of silence? Oh, it's brilliant. In the forest, silence is not empty. It's filled with tension, expectation, the faint suggestion that something unseen is waiting. In the castle, silence becomes suffocating, amplifying every footstep until it feels like a drumbeat of doom. In the cottage, silence is comfort, the pause after laughter, the hush before sleep. These variations remind us that sound and image work hand in hand to shape place. What we don't hear is just as important as what we see. By the end of the film, I realized I was carrying these places inside me as much as the characters. The castle haunted me. The forest lingered in my imagination like a dream half-remembered. The cottage warmed me like a distant memory of home. That's the power of setting and cinematic elements when they're handled with care. They become not just locations but companions, echoing the story's themes long after the credits roll. Because, in truth, we don't just remember stories for their plots. We remember how they felt. We remember the shiver of walking into a hall where shadows fall too long. We remember the comfort of firelight on wooden beams. We remember the breathless panic of running through trees that seem alive with menace. This film understands that deeply, and it uses its settings not as background but as soul. There's something enchanting about the fact that films are made not in silence, but in chaos. To sit in a theater and watch the finished story unfold feels seamless, almost inevitable, as if the world you're seeing was always meant to exist. But behind the curtain, the truth is much messier, filled with laughter, exhaustion, unexpected miracles, and the kind of fragile camaraderie that can only be born when 100 people are trying, against all odds, to build the same dream. That's what I love most about remembering this particular production. The way it reminds us that art doesn't come from perfection, but from the messy, human process of creation. Take, for instance, the forest scenes. On screen, the forest feels alive, dense, and atmospheric, but the actual shooting location was far less accommodating. Imagine mud up to your ankles, mosquitoes that seem to arrive in swarms at the sound of the director yelling, "Action," and unpredictable weather that changed faster than the crew could adjust lights. One day, after hours of careful setup, a sudden downpour collapsed equipment, soaked costumes, and turned the forest floor into a swamp. Everyone assumed the day was lost. But instead of despair, something else happened. The cast began laughing, stomping through puddles like children. The director, instead of calling a halt, whispered to the cinematographer, "Roll anyway." That night's footage, rain cascading through trees, actors running with genuine, unchoreographed energy, became one of the film's most breathtaking sequences. Moments like that defined the production. Accidents transformed into poetry. Then there was the castle, which wasn't a single place but a patchwork of sets and real historical locations stitched together through careful editing and design. The main hall, with its towering arches, was filmed in a centuries-old fortress where the crew had to tiptoe around fragile stonework and avoid triggering alarms set to protect priceless heritage. The irony? Between takes, the cast would sprawl across the cold floors, eating snacks from paper bags, their costumes glittering with sequins and embroidery while they munched potato chips. It was such a striking image, this clash of grandeur and mundanity, that one of the crew joked they should release a backstage reel titled Royalty Eats Doritos. The atmosphere among the actors was something special too. They came from wildly different backgrounds, stage veterans with voices trained for Shakespeare, newcomers still learning how to find their mark, and seasoned film stars accustomed to green screens and global premieres. You might expect friction, but what blossomed instead was mentorship. The older cast members would quietly guide the younger ones, giving tips about timing, breath control, or how to conserve energy during long shooting days. One touching story still stands out. During a particularly difficult emotional scene, one of the younger actors couldn't quite summon the vulnerability required. Instead of frustration, their scene partner took them aside, away from cameras, and shared a personal story of failure and hope. When they returned to set, the performance that followed was raw, trembling, unforgettable. Everyone on set knew they had just captured lightning in a bottle. Of course, it wasn't all tenderness and poetry. There were challenges that tested patience and resilience. Costumes, for instance, became a recurring ordeal. The gowns and armor looked exquisite on camera, but wearing them was another story. Heavy fabrics caused actors to overheat under studio lights, and elaborate headpieces sometimes wobbled so precariously that scenes had to be res-hot. In one notorious case, a towering crown slipped mid-scene and landed directly over an actor's eyes, leaving them to deliver lines half-blind while the crew struggled not to burst out laughing. That take was obviously unusable, but the blooper reel became an instant classic among the team. Props created their own comedy. The enchanted mirror, designed to gleam with an eerie, otherworldly glow, was notoriously fragile. During one rehearsal, a clumsy stagehand leaned a little too heavily against it, and the entire thing shattered. There was a moment of stunned silence, then nervous laughter, then a frantic phone call to the art department. By morning, they had rebuilt it, sturdier, more convincing, and, ironically, far easier to film. Sometimes failure is just the universe's way of forcing improvement. One of my favorite behind-the-scenes dynamics came from the dwarves scenes. The actors cast in those roles quickly became the soul of the production, known for their jokes, their pranks, and their uncanny ability to lift spirits when exhaustion weighed heavy. They would rewrite entire lines of dialogue during rehearsals, slipping in modern slang just to see if anyone noticed. More than once, the director had to stifle laughter while calling cut, because a scene had derailed into improvisation. Yet those playful experiments often uncovered unexpected gems, lines or gestures that eventually made it into the final cut. The camaraderie extended beyond the actors. The crew, often invisible to the audience, were a family of their own. Camera operators who spent hours balancing rigs on uneven terrain would challenge each other to races during breaks, weaving through set pieces with heavy equipment as though it were a sport. Makeup artists shared whispered gossip while frantically reapplying smudged lipstick. Sound technicians, perched in trees to catch the perfect natural ambience, swapped bird-watching notes between takes. This was a community, not just a workplace. And then there were the nights, the grueling, beautiful nights. Night shoots are notoriously difficult, requiring stamina, patience, and gallons of coffee. Yet they also carried a strange kind of magic. Imagine standing in the forest at midnight, the set illuminated by artificial moonlight, mist machines curling fog across the ground. Everyone knew it was fabricated, but the illusion was so complete that it felt real. More than once, crew members admitted they had to remind themselves they weren't living inside the story. That sense of immersion infused the work with sincerity. The actors weren't just pretending to be afraid of shadows. In the hush of those late hours, with owls hooting and branches cracking, the fear felt startlingly authentic. Not everything could be solved with laughter or luck. Technical challenges sometimes pushed the team to the brink. One particularly complex sequence involved combining practical stunts with digital effects, a chase through the woods, ending in a waterfall plunge. The logistics were a nightmare. Harnesses malfunctioned, camera drones crashed into branches, and the stunt double narrowly avoided injury when a cable snapped during testing. After several failed attempts, frustration ran high. But then, on a cool morning when everyone was running on little more than caffeine and stubbornness, it all came together. The stunt landed perfectly, the cameras caught every angle, and the director erupted into cheers. Later, when the scene appeared in the final cut, no trace of the struggle remained, just fluid, heart-pounding beauty. There's something profoundly moving about that transformation, the way exhaustion, mistakes, and near disasters crystallize into the seamless magic of cinema. Watching the finished story, you'd never guess that behind every shot was a web of human effort, compromise, and perseverance. I'll never forget the final day of filming, when the last scene wrapped and the crew burst into spontaneous applause. Some hugged, others cried. The director gave a short speech, voice-breaking, thanking everyone for building not just a film but a memory. The strangest part was the silence afterward. 4 months, the set had been a second home, filled with chatter, clattering equipment, laughter, and the endless rhythm of rolling and cut. Suddenly, it was over. The forest was just a forest again. The castle walls stood empty. The cottage, stripped of props, was nothing more than bare wood. The magic lingered only in the people who had created it. That's what stays with me most when I think about these behind-the-scenes insights. Not the accidents or the frustrations, not even the funny stories of crowns slipping or mirrors shattering, though those are unforgettable in their own right. What stays is the humanity of it all. The way strangers became collaborators, collaborators became friends, and friends became something like family. The film that audiences see is a fairy tale, but the story behind the cameras is its own kind of fairy tale, messy, imperfect, full of obstacles, and yet brimming with laughter, resilience, and grace. And maybe that's why the finished work feels so alive. Because every frame carries within it not just artistry, but the echo of real people giving everything they had, their sweat, their tears, their laughter, to make something beautiful.